today's episode, we are going to be diving into a topic that affects millions of people worldwide, anxiety and depression. My guest today, Brian Sachetta. Brian, you are the author of Get Out of Your Head. You spent about 10 years battling anxiety and depression.
I have reason to believe that other people have gotten through this before and other people have worked through their anxiety or managed it.
I have battled with anxiety and depression myself. Who hasn't?
I wrote a book about anxiety. It's not like I'm infallible, right? I still experience anxiety from time to time. You are only as sick as your secret. So when you hold something in, you're giving it power. When you open up and say, hey friend, hey mom, hey dad, I'm dealing with this thing, you're putting it onto the table and shining light on it. And you're saying, this may still be awful, but I'm not allowing it to hold that same weight. Anxiety and depression are very difficult to deal with. Just want to send a message of solidarity to the audience.
Welcome to Rosabel Unscripted, the podcast where authenticity meets real life stories. I'm your host, Rosabel Zohfeld, and in each episode, I dive into unscripted conversations about personal growth, life challenges, and the experiences that shaped us. From heart-to-heart chats with inspiring guests to raw moments of self-discovery, I am here to share stories that connect us all. Whether you're seeking motivation, healing, or simply a dose of real talk, you are in the right place. So get comfortable, tune in, and join me on this journey of transformation, empowerment, and meaningful conversations. This is Rosabel Unscripted. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Rosabel Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Rosabel Zohfeld, and in today's episode, we are going to be diving into a topic that affects millions of people worldwide. We're going to be navigating anxiety and depression. As a nurse practitioner and someone who believes deeply in patient-centered care, I know how isolating it can feel to struggle with mental health issues. My guest today, Brian Sachetta. Brian, you are the author of a series of books called Get Out of Your Head. Is that correct?
That's correct. And thank you for having me as well, Rosabel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Brian, you spent about 10 years dealing with or battling anxiety and depression. And now you dedicate yourself to help others escape this abyss of despair. So in our conversation, I believe our listeners will hear your personal story, practical strategies from your book, Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2. Why don't I let you introduce yourself to my audience?
I'm Brian Sachetta. I'm the owner and author of Get Out of Your Head, which is a brand and book series that seeks to help folks manage or overcome anxiety and depression.
What prompted you to write this book?
Definitely. So speaking on the first book, so I guess a little shameless plug here is the first book is called Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. So that was a product of personal experience. And honestly, the second one was as well. But if I speak specifically to the first book about anxiety, it really began like late high school, right? So I think it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I would say like I lived a pretty nice life. I had a great family and all that. One thing that's tricky growing up is you sometimes look around and you say to yourself, like, I have a good life, I have a good family, I have friends and all that, but like, why do I deal with anxiety? Why is my mind seemingly against me? Why do I struggle with these things? And so that was something that I had trouble coming to terms with, understanding that I lived a good life, but then also like there was this inner battle. In high school, I remember just normal things like, and when I say normal, right, the events of everyday life and of growing up. So I would get nervous about basketball games and track meets and talking to women that I was interested in and going on dates and all that stuff. So again, I guess I just like, it's hard to meet every single person where they're at, right? So everybody's going to meet anxiety from a different spot. Many people who are listening may have childhood trauma, and that could be a source of the anxiety. Like we can speak to that, but that was not my upbringing, or that was not my past. My past was more just kind of those everyday experiences, right? And understanding, or at least feeling like I didn't know what to do about them. And I would get very, very nervous well in advance of them, right? I'd have a track meet a week in advance, or it would be a week away. And I would be so horribly nervous. And for a long time, I didn't tell anybody about how, what I was feeling on the inside and how my mind seemed to work and all that. And part of that was I didn't really know. I was like, well, I'm nervous and I guess this is normal because I care about this track meet. I care about this basketball game. But it got to the point of feeling as though, even though I maybe told myself it was kind of normal, or like there was a reason that I felt that way, you go week after week and you're like, I really shouldn't be nervous. I shouldn't be anxious all the time. And I will say that during that period, as I was ramping up into understanding anxiety, I didn't even know the words. I didn't know the lexicon or the vocabulary or anything like that. So I would just tell myself I was really nervous in these different situations. I didn't really know what the term anxiety was or meant. I didn't know the term panic attack and all that. And so kind of fast forward, right? Like the journey that I went on to write this book was basically me going from being 17 years old to, somewhere in the range of 27. And along that time, it was me diving into, the literature around mental health, going to therapy, talking to other people, reading journal articles, synthesizing down the information that I had gleaned over that 10-year period and trying to figure out like, hey, what parts of this information, which of these tactics that I've learned are useful for me and which ones are not. And I got to the point where I struggled so mightily early on in not having the information that I said to myself, if an 18-year-old kid who's in high school or college or whatever can look around and say, I'm struggling really, really badly with this thing, but I don't even know where to begin, then there's a target market there and there's a problem, right? And so when I eventually wrote the book, I kind of looked back and I thought of myself as that high school or college kid and said, I want to find that kid who's in his dorm room, right? I want to reach him and say, you don't have to go on this battle alone. And you also don't necessarily need to take 10 years to figure it all out, right? Hopefully I can get to that person a little bit sooner and say, here are some of the tactics that I wish I knew at that age that would have helped me. And I guess just one more piece on sort of the journey. And obviously we can dive further into all of this, but what I was really doing was going from having no knowledge to some knowledge and then like taking that knowledge along the way and saying, okay, for example, I have a class presentation. I need to stand up in front of my marketing class, present a PowerPoint, and leading up to it, I'm really anxious about it. In all of those situations, I was thinking to myself, it's not easy to deal with the anxiety, but I'm like, okay, other people don't necessarily have this same reaction. And by the literature and the information that I'm reading, I have reason to believe that other people have gotten through this before and other people have worked through their anxiety or managed it. And so I kind of took this perspective to say, I'm going to go to all of these situations and I'm going to try out different tactics in hopes that some of them work for me. And then eventually on the other side of it, I'm going to come out and I'm going to say, man, maybe it was, sometimes I thought I'd write a book and sometimes I didn't, but I was kind of in my head, I was like, at the very least, I will have created my own mental health toolkit, right? I will be able to say, these are the 5, these are the 10 tactics that I like that work for me. It's tricky because when you're writing a book, you're catering to a large and wide audience and not everything resonates with everybody. But at the same time, I thought to myself, might as well get started, might as well talk about what has been helpful for me because I'd rather reach some people than nobody at all if I don't write the book. So that's it in a nutshell, but obviously there's a lot to dive into. So let me know what questions you have.
Awesome. Wow. So many questions come to mind right now. I have a lot of curiosity, especially I have battled with anxiety and depression myself. I mean, in a way, if you think about it, who hasn't, at this point? Maybe other people, some more than others, right? Because of the fast-paced world that we live in today. But a couple questions. Did you ever find what was perhaps a culprit in your case particularly? Because we tend to see, well, the moment that we think anxiety or depression, we think stress maybe. A lot of times genetics, it was somebody in your family. Was there a history of it and so on? So what can you tell me about that?
And I do want to be careful. Like, I'm happy to tell my story. At the same time, you mentioned how there are a lot of different factors, right? So for folks who are listening, my story is not going to be their story and vice versa. What I really got to was the understanding that some of this does run in my family, right? And then some of it is just a little bit of like thought patterns, right? You develop these patterns along the course of your life where, maybe you had an inclination to worry at an early age. And then at some point that worry somehow benefits you on some level. But it benefits you to the degree of like you're saying to yourself, I have so much uncertainty around this job interview, this date, this basketball game. And there's there can be something in the subconscious mind that basically says, well, even though it doesn't make me feel that great, I know that if I worry, I can kind of control some of it, or I can at least attempt to control some of it. Right. So for me, I saw that pattern playing out again and again and again. It's just understanding the way that you work and the way that you're wired, right? So one of the reasons that I named my brand Get Out of Your Head was this understanding that I came to at some point in my life that so much of the suffering that I was experiencing was a product of my own thoughts. And I know that there was a point early on in, I think I would say adolescence, right? So like being in high school, being in college, like I would always hear from my elders and the people that I respected, talking about things like the law of attraction and sort of like manifesting and all that. So people would say, hey, in order to make this thing in the external world come to reality, come to fruition, you need to envision it on the internal world, right? And I took that, the internal world being the mind, and I took that so literally for so long. And I think a lot of us do, right? Where we say, okay, I've got this job interview. I'm really scared of the interview. If I just think about it all the time, if I see myself succeeding in that situation, if I see myself leaving the job interview, with an offer in hand, then all of a sudden I'm going to boost my confidence. I'm going to be able to perform better when the event actually arrives, and everything's going to go really well. The challenge, right, is like you never, for most people, especially when it comes to anxiety, you never get to that sense of certainty, right? There's just this loop that can continue to run. And so for me, it was like understanding that one, some of this runs in my family, but also two, I run these loops. Part of my anxiety is also obsessive compulsive disorder, which kind of lives under that umbrella, right? And when it comes to OCD, what people will often say is it's as if the mind cannot close the loop. It can't say, we did that task, we're done, right? It's the quintessential thing that people think of when it comes to something like OCD is, oh, did I turn the stove off, right? Or did I close that door or whatever? And no matter how many times you have thought about it and checked it, your mind wants to go back and go back and go back. And so for me, it was that understanding of like, okay, this is how my brain works. But when I'm, leading up to these scary situations, combined with some of the logic of the law of attraction and all that, my mind is saying, focus and ruminate and rehash and think this thing all the way through. And what ends up happening, right, is like the more that you do that, and inevitably, if it's got that sort of OCD flavor to it where you can't stop the loop, you're just generating more and more and more anxiety. And you get to the point where like it's still not working, but your brain won't let it go. And so understanding that pattern and just saying like, I know that that's what my brain wants to do. I'm taking a step back and I'm understanding that it's not helpful. And when I see that pattern playing out, I need to intervene, right? I need to jump in and I need to say, hold on a second, let's hit the brakes, let's go do something else and try to get ourselves out of this. That was a big revelation for me. And it's funny, like I'll pull the curtain back a tiny bit. I think in the mental health space these days, it's become really popular to do psychedelics like mushrooms or ayahuasca or something like that. And I actually did an ayahuasca trip a few years ago. And I remember going into it being like, oh, what am I going to learn? Like maybe it's going to say that I had some deep-seated trauma or whatever. And in that experience I had, the thing that I talked to, sometimes people will say, you talk to yourself, you talk to a deity, you talk to a product of your own mind. I don't exactly know what it is, but you talk to something. And the thing was like, dude, you have anxiety. That's how your brain works. Like, there's no larger thing here. If you're continually, hunting for the white whale of like, oh, my uncle did XYZ when I was young. It was like, move on, figure out how to work with your brain and keep doing your thing.
And then earlier, you also mentioned something that is quite remarkable in a way. And let me tell you why, because you're not the only person I've heard it from. When you introduced yourself, you said, I had a normal childhood. Somehow you feel like, why am I feeling this way? And check this out. You ask yourself that question, but this is what has happened to me and probably to you. I don't know, other people out there. Sometimes, let's say we are anxious or nervous, and then I don't know if it was a family member that reached out to you. I wonder why. You don't have reasons to be sad. Look at all this and that. And I'm like, but still happening. And you look around and you say, yes, that is true in my case. Yes, I've been blessed. Yes, I don't have this, but your body is still having those feelings. So it's such an interesting thought in the sense that we cannot generalize, the whole thing. So again, when people in the public think anxiety, depression, they're thinking, oh, again, trauma. Oh, something. You see what I'm saying? It's like, so the mind is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad that you highlighted it because it's really important to talk about. And I often, in my research, my writing, my discussions, I will inevitably slide back towards evolutionary psychology. Because to me, it's just fascinating to think about, like, how did we evolve as humans? Like, what was life like many years ago? And there's a theory to basically say, like, okay, so many years ago, like hundreds of thousands of years ago, it was like we were rewarded for always kind of looking out and being like, hey, there's some hungry predator that's trying to kill me, So we have these mechanisms in our brains, like specifically thinking about like the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, which is always it's like an alarm system, right? It's always looking for that next threat. And you now slide over to today and you're like, we still have all those same mechanisms in the brain. I know I only mentioned the amygdala, but the brain is pretty old, right? It hasn't evolved in like 30,000 to 100,000 years. We now live in a world that's much different than the one in which that brain evolved. And so we have the same hardware, but it's almost as if it can't keep up in this new modern world of ours, right? Where there's endless stressors. There are stressors that are like off in the distance and not necessarily these ones that we can just run away from. Oftentimes people will say that anxiety can be, or maybe is, a product of what they would call evolutionary mismatch, which is what I had kind of just stated, right? We evolved in a certain environment. That environment is now very different. And so our brains were well suited for that environment, maybe on the plains of Africa. And now we find ourselves in cubicles, and it's a very different world and we can't always keep up with it. And sometimes that's where the anxiety comes from, which is basically that fear center continually sounding and us not being able to necessarily get away from some of those stressors because we can't fight with them, we can't flee them, or they're just chronic. Whereas before it was like, sure, yeah, there's predators that are after me and all that, but like if I run away from it, I'm good. Nowadays, right, it's like you may go to work every day in a hostile environment, and that's something that you can't run away from, especially if, your finances depend on it, which
I've
most
been
of us,
there. The fact that you were there and you literally want to run away at that moment and you can't. Because you know what would happen if you run away. And sometimes something as simple like, I really need an hour. You don't, especially in my position, you don't have an hour. You don't have, I'll be right back kind of thing. You're taking care of the public, you're taking care of a patient. And there's where that whole dichotomy, and there's a lot more. It's kind of like a re-injury of the injury in a way sometimes, because you're like, well, am I a machine or am I a person? Oh my God, there's so much to talk about when it comes to that. And yeah, the whole evolving thing. Now, here's what I was also thinking when it comes to the genetics. Somehow, I cannot fully think of it, how to explain it now, but there is memory, right? Our brains have memory, and perhaps we have that memory from our ancestors, right? Comes emotions, right? And then we're living into perhaps there's the memory of our mom or dad or people that went. And so this fears, anxiety, this still somehow still circulating in our psyche in a way that we don't even know, right?
Well, I've done a tiny bit, I guess. A couple of things that come to mind. So one is like the notion of generational trauma. It's always hard to cite, right? Because like it's so awful. But it's like, let's say, God forbid, like one of your ancestors was killed in the Holocaust or involved in the Holocaust, right? It's like there are, to your point, right? There are reactions that occur and there are changes that happen on a physiological level where like then, that person has a kid who has a kid who has a kid. And some of that trauma gets passed down in different ways. Maybe it's the way that people respond to stress. Maybe it's the fact that, somebody develops an overactive stress response in general, where, there's not just the genes, but there's also the behavior, right? So it's funny because, sometimes people will say like, oh, I see this happen, this specific trait runs in this family. And it's like, that could be the genes. That could also be the fact that, you live for most people, right? You live with your family till you're 18 or some age, maybe older, and you pick up all the same habits or many of the habits that your parents have, right? Where it's like they do things certain ways and you model them. And so, yeah, I think that we tend to try to there's the generational trauma piece that is definitely subconscious. It's not something that we really have much of a choice in, right? But the modeling other people's behaviors, I think we do that because we're like, oh, well, my mom, when she deals with stress, this is how she reacts to it. So if she's gotten by in the world, then that's how I'm going to try it. And eventually, I think part of growing up is understanding that as much as your parents can be amazing people, like when you're really young, you see them as like gods. God forbid you didn't live in a great household or there was abuse or anything, then you wouldn't see them as gods. But so what ends up happening is like you look at your parents and you're like, let's just say hypothetically, you look at them in sort of that godlike fashion, or they can do no wrong. They have it all figured out, right? And so we mirror their behavior because we're like, if my brain is telling me that they are gods or whatever the word is, then I should do what they do. So that way I can be like them. And as you get older, right, you start to realize that your parents can be amazing. They can be loving people, but they're people, they're humans, and all humans are flawed, right? And so eventually I think we get to the point where we're like, okay, I've been modeling that behavior. I've been modeling this other one. And guess what? Like now that I'm thinking about it, maybe that one specific behavior doesn't suit me so much. Growing up, part of that is trying on those different behaviors and seeing what works and what doesn't, right? And a lot of people will say that when they go to have kids, they're like, I am going to correct the mistakes, quote unquote, that my parents made with me. I'm not going to do any of those things with my kids. And it's just funny because that's life, right? What ends up happening is maybe we overcorrect for some of those traits. And then our kids are like, oh, Brian did this specific thing. My dad did this specific thing. And I'm not going to do that with my kids. But that's kind of life, right? Is trying on these behaviors, seeing how they suit you, and inevitably trying to grow up and live a good life. It's a complicated process.
And also there is the issue with society at large, right? And different groups and the cultures, let's put it that way. And the cultures and subcultures. So what's right, according to the culture, and what is wrong, right? And then we have here, I don't know, but in US, to me, maybe because that's what I do, and to many of us, we live a lot of time or spend a lot of time at work. So what's appropriate, what's not appropriate? And like one of the things I also notice is when it comes to emotions is, you probably heard this many times, like fake it until you make it, don't, if you show any vulnerability, that's some sort of a sign of being weak, or who knows, right? And so I don't know until how much that is actually causing more, let's say, injury or damage. I couldn't say one way or the other necessarily. But again, those are also things to consider as well when we think about this. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you, and so your book, so the new book, the volume 2, how many years or how much time between 1 and 2?
There wasn't that much time. I published the first one at the end of 2018 and then the second one at the end of 2021. So it's 3 years. I don't know. Some of that is momentum, when it's like, hey, I just finished a book. Let me keep going. And some of it is the amount of time that you have. I was, consulting or freelancing for a good chunk of that time period. And so if a project ended or, it would be more likely that I would just come into a month where I had time, right? And so when I had that time, I was like, rather than let my mind go crazy like it wants to when I have nothing to do, I'm going to go jump into some task. And I will say also that, like with the second book, so just to plug that one, that is Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. Some of it was a conscious choice to say, like, I have this information and I want to write about it. But a lot of it was more, I was coming up on finishing my first manuscript and publishing it and feeling as though, it was sort of like the angel and the demon on opposite shoulders, and the angel was saying, congratulations, you've come so far. You've learned a lot about anxiety and mental health, and now you're going to help all these people. And then the devil was sort of like, I guess to step back and if I can be candid, right? Like at that same time, I was actually very depressed and I was going through a deep, dark episode. And so that devil was saying like, you don't really know anything. I can't believe you even published that book. Sort of imposter syndrome in a way, right? And also saying like, you published that book and yet you are really mentally unhealthy right now. Like why, almost like who are you to have published that book? And so one thing that became helpful for me was sort of looking at it therapeutically to be like, look, I don't know where I'm going to get. I don't know what the book is going to look like. But right now, me going through this depressive episode, the book was really helpful because it gave me a target. But to say like, don't give up, like you have people who want to read this book and you have people that you can serve and you need to serve yourself as well. So figure out how to get through this thing and have that be your target of like, I'm not giving up because I want to write this darn book. And that was sort of like, I guess what I did, I took the same mindset of the first book in the sense of dealing with a struggle, right? And wanting to figure it out, because that's like the engineer in me. For folks who don't know me, which would probably be most of them, I'm a software developer by trade, and that's what I do for my day job. And so like I'm very curious to see how things tick and how they work. And I want to break them apart and put them back together and all that. So sometimes people will say like, you latch onto one thing and that's the thing that gets you through. And I feel like in that moment or that period of going through that depressive episode, it was like, some people may say, I'm doing it for my family, I'm doing it for my kids or whatever. And, I was single at the time and I was like, I'm doing it for the book. I want to write this book. I want to make sense of this. I want to, get back to a state where I'm not totally depressed all the time. And then I want to help more people. So that was kind of like how that book came about. It's fascinating where the things that you learn on the journey are like not necessarily the ones that you think you're going to learn, right? But life has a way of sort of bringing you the things that you need at certain times and teaching you certain lessons, right? And so it was a very challenging battle, but like I look back and I think to myself, I don't want to say I'm grateful because honestly, like if anybody who's listening or if you've been in that state, like nobody wants to be in that state. Like it's so horrible. You're like, why do I exist? Why should I be alive? What is the meaning of life? Like you're just asking the most horrible questions. And at times it's irredemptive. There's nothing to pull away from it or take out of it. I look at it kind of it's basically the people will sometimes say, I'm not happy that I went through it. I don't wish that upon anybody else. I wouldn't want to go through it again. But I did go through it and I feel like I made as much sense of it as I could. And from that lens, looking back, I'm like, it did result in positive things, right? In the sense that I was then able to write that book and I was able to help some people with depression. That's kind of the silver lining of it.
Awesome.
From that standpoint, I am happy about that.
That's awesome. A couple of things I want to mention on that. I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm an author myself and I wrote a book. It's like a memoir talking about growing up in Colombia and all these things and losing my mother and so on and all kinds of hardships into becoming a nurse practitioner and so on. But one of the things I've also noticed is I believe that as authors, we somehow at one point or another, we have experienced that imposter syndrome for sure. I for surely have in a way. And you're right. We have those like, who do you think you are when you write a book? And here's the other thing I've noticed too, which I have found helpful. Because when we write a book, when we put something out there, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, somehow we see ourselves or somebody tends to see ourselves as like we are the experts per se, or we must know something about it, right? And then somehow we might believe it, we might not. And then next thing is like, I got to live up to the expectations kind of thing, right? But then the moment for me was when I'm like, you know what? It's just a book. It's my story. I wrote it. Yes, this and that. But when you start seeing yourself as a work in progress. So I am as human. I am as fallible, but it's that constant like, oh, am I going to be judged, because let's say I write something about, like in my book towards the end, I write about perhaps those happy moments that I have with my family and this and that. So when I find myself a little bit kind of like, living a normal life, a normal moment, it's always like, ooh, am I living up to that final chapter of my book that says everything is beautiful now, It's not forgetting that this is, again, look at you. You have volume 1, now you have volume 2, and who knows, maybe you will write a volume 3, right? Because it's a process. And in that process, we end up discovering ourselves. And for me, it's about remembering that we are as human and as fallible and, everything is not written, if you know what I mean, right? So
I totally know what you mean. Yeah.
And so you do have I was reading that you have some research-backed strategies that help you like with motivation to stay focused, especially with depression. I wanted to ask you this. How did you balance the emotional honesty of your story with presenting that clinical data and practical tools?
It's funny because that has always come naturally to me in the sense that what I will say is it's very rare that I write something in the middle of an episode, right? So like if I were battling depression, I'm not writing a book being like, hey, here's how to, XYZ depression. There's an honesty piece to that where it's like, I'm not going to put a piece of content out in hopes of serving my audience when I'm not even serving myself yet, But if I feel as though I have learned something, got a grip on something, then I will write about it. And so for me, like, I think that's always come naturally. The idea of saying, okay, here's a story, as in this is an anxious episode that I dealt with, a depressive episode that I dealt with, and here's how it concluded, or here are some of the tactics I enlisted to get through that thing. And then as I'm telling that story and I'm giving the tactics, like, I inevitably am like, I want to make this seem as legitimate as I can. So I'm going to weave in the sources, right? So either I will directly say, in the 1924 study by so-and-so, right, the thing that I'm talking about was affirmed, or I'll just have like a bunch of research that I footnote, in the actual content. So I don't know. To me, that has always come naturally. And I think some of that honestly comes from my day job, whereas like I'm essentially like a product person, they would call it, in like the tech world. So I do write mobile apps, but also like I've done a bunch of design before. And I'm not saying that I'm not amazing at it or anything like that, but the more that you are product centric and user focused, the more that you're like gaining that critical eye to be like, sure, I can think that something is good. I might even think it's great, but I know that I need to talk to people and I need to be like, am I the only one that thinks this is good? Or like, what do you guys think of it? Right? Kind of like doing research, user research and focus groups and stuff like that. The more that you delve into that world, I think the more that you try to make things more approachable, right? Because you're like, there's the person who wrote their book in their ivory tower and they've got like tons of big words and all that, and they're trying to sound fancy. But what I'm trying to do is be approachable, right? I want to make sure that people can read this stuff, not get bored, not get turned off, get through it, but then also say, hey, that was valuable. I understood it because it was approachable, it was digestible. And then hopefully they can take that information and apply it in their own lives. Cause like, otherwise, like from my vantage point, why else am I doing this? Right. But like, I don't know. I've been to enough therapy and talked about myself enough times where I'm like, that doesn't really get me going these days. It's more like, I want to be able to serve this audience. I want to be able to make an impact. As you probably know, it's like when you deal with anxiety, when you deal with depression, when you deal with hard things, those things become like part of you. And when that suffering really grows and you're like, oh my God, I know how bad anxiety is. I know how bad it can be. Same thing with depression. It becomes part of you and you're like, all I want to do, if you see that somebody else is experiencing those things, you then look at them and you're like, I feel that emotion in me and I see it coming from you and I know how brutal that is. And all I want to do is try to stomp that out or try to help you with it. So that's kind of the perspective that I take on the books. Obviously, like, I think that storytelling is important and I think that people resonate with that sort of thing. So that's just the way that I tailor my content. But if a lot of people were like, hey, go more academic, go more in the line of research or whatever, I would consider that as well. I'm just trying to hit as many people as I can. So,
but let me say something. The power of storytelling is amazing. And that's one of the reasons why I actually started my podcast, because I had the book and then I was like, okay, how do I get my book out there? How do I get the message out there? Right. And it's a trial. I'm not going to call it error, the last book is not an error. It's a trial, right? But also it's a discovery. For me, it has been a tremendous blessing. It's also been very therapeutic because I happen to have the authors here talking about their books. And then I will tell you something. I've been reading the authors that come on my show. I love to read their book because it's so interesting. We have a conversation, right? And then I'm like, I remember perhaps what you said. I'm like, let me try to pick up his brain a little bit more into that. So instead of perhaps me calling or whatever, I go back into your book and it's like getting in the back of your brain or the author's message. Like, so interesting, right? So I completely love it. And I know how, storytelling is very, very powerful tool in so many ways. I agree with you when you say that, and I've said this many times here, that every book, every creative process that we have, everything has an audience. And then you also said, well, if somebody may want me to do something, but at the end of the day, however you will feel more comfortable with, and then we may not be able to help. And I don't know, it's like everybody helps in little ways, right? I didn't realize, like, for example, what I'm doing here, bringing this message to other people, we never know who's listening, right? So we never know who could be helped by our message. So that is awesome. And I want to thank you for that, because it's not easy. Not everybody gets to do what you and I do, to open our hearts and to kind of say like, hey, I'm going through this too, and also helps other people who do not know or perhaps have a little bit of fear of showing their real self, the real truth. And so people like you and I were like, okay, we're willing to put ourselves in the line and say, hey, I don't mind talking about what's going on with me. We want to normalize it. Let's put it that way. We want to make it human.
Definitely. And it's tough because with anxiety and depression, right, there is always this sense. I like everything that I say, like, I'm never judging on this stuff because I deal with it too. And even though I wrote a book about anxiety, like, it's not like I'm infallible, right? I still experience anxiety from time to time. The difference is that it's not as bad as it used to be, and I have my tools now. The challenge with these conditions, right, anxiety and depression, is when we experience them, they make us want to withdraw from the world, right?
Yes.
To sort of close ourselves off. And the challenge is that when we do that, they end up becoming worse. So we're like, hey, I'm experiencing anxiety. I can't talk about it. I can't tell other people about it. Instead of going to that party and trying to have a good time, my social anxiety is basically telling me stay home and do something else, you know? And obviously everybody has to do what they think makes sense for them. It's like, no, you do what makes sense for you. At the same time, we do know that there is a pattern to anxiety and depression, right? And it's like very, very common with depression is this feedback loop. They call it a positive feedback loop, but it's, you know, to us, it's actually negative in the sense that it gets worse. It's just called positive because it builds upon itself. So you feel depressed, you withdraw from the world, you feel even more depressed because you are withdrawn from the world, and so on and so on. Similar thing can happen with anxiety, and where you eventually get to, and you know, obviously anxiety and depression are related, but not the same, but where you eventually get to with these conditions is understanding, right, that there's a quote that you'll see on social media, and I talk about it all the time, is you are only as sick as your secrets, right? So when you hold something in, you're giving it power. When you open up and you say, hey, friend, hey, mom, hey, dad, hey, so-and-so, like, I'm dealing with this thing, you're putting it onto the table in the light, and you're shining that light on it, and you're saying, like, this may still be awful, but I'm not allowing it to hold that same weight over me, right? I'm not allowing it to stay deep inside of me where it's going to grow and fester. I'm like, I'm going to put it on the table. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to figure it out. And so I know that that's a common pattern with these conditions. And I also see that in myself. And, you know, I'm not the most vocal person in the world. I'm not going to be immediately raising my hand, but it's something that I see in that a pattern in myself. And I'm like, okay, I know that this is how these things work. So that's why I do podcasts like this, right? Is to get out and to talk to people like yourself, but then also spread the message of folks who are listening and they're like, oh my God, I deal with anxiety. I can't tell anybody about it. It's the worst thing in the world. Yes, it's painful. It's difficult, but it's okay to talk about it. And I hope that conversations like this one, as you mentioned, I hope that a conversation like this normalizes all of these different subjects and difficulties.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you ever heard this, a saying that goes, depression hurts. And let me say why, because when I have felt it, it's a pain that is perhaps a little bit, for me, it's hard to describe, but it feels very physical. It feels physical. It feels like, to me, it has felt like somebody's just grabbing you and like squeezing you down into your chest. It hurts.
Yeah.
Then you try all these different things and you try to go out, you try to to see if you can distract yourself, and the pain is right there. Like, I experienced it very much when I have postpartum depression. It was very, very awful. But again, you're right. When we learn how to cope and we learn these coping mechanisms, we're able to, like, for example, now at my stage, I'm able to, like, that's anxiety. I remember many, many years ago when my heart will start pounding, or like I'll immediately go to the emergency room. I thought I was having a heart attack. I'm like, no, I know what it is. And then you start breathing and do some other things and so on. And so kind of like learning, like, okay, I know what this is, and like recognizing it. So yeah.
Absolutely. It still stinks when your heart is racing, but at least, you know, you understand what it is. And it's challenging to go through those things because the first time that your heart races, the first time you have a panic attack, like, you literally think you're going to die. And I'm certainly not glamorizing a panic attack. I'm not even trying to say like there's anything good about it. All I'm trying to say is, like, when you go through 1 and then 5 and then 10, sure, all of them stink, but at least you start to understand what they are. And it's all like kind of all tied up in this conversation of is when you can say to yourself that even if it hurts, it's normal or it's common or it's not abnormal to experience these things, you then are able to reassure yourself in the moment. And so much of anxiety, a little bit of depression, but depression can obviously be a different beast. So much of anxiety is that reassurance piece, right? Because again, going back to the fear center of the brain is if you are like with your conscious mind, right, with your prefrontal cortex, if you are thinking, this is so bad, this is awful, oh my goodness, you're basically sending a signal back to your amygdala, the fear center of the brain, and saying, you are right to sound the alarms. And you know what? Keep sounding them because this is real bad, right? And you get into this ping pong effect where the amygdala is sounding, and then you're like, oh, things got worse, so this really is bad. And the negative thoughts keep swirling, which leads to, a larger response from the amygdala. And so it's like, when you can finally step in and say, hey, this might be horrible, this might not be fun to experience, but this is actually normal. It's okay that the body does this. I know why the body does this. Then you break that chain and you say to yourself, hey, guess what, amygdala? Like, I understand it stinks and there's a lot of uncertainty going on right now, but this is how the brain works. This is how the body works. We'll be okay in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And that's often what it takes to diffuse something like anxiety.
Yes, that is exactly right. And so tell me a little bit about what do we describe like let's say, like an actionable exercise that you actually put into the book, like a simple daily practice, something that the listeners can perhaps start doing immediately.
Yeah, so let's try to do two. One will be anxiety, one will be depression. Anxiety is tightly coupled with the acute stress response in the body. Your amygdala detects a threat, you go into high alert, so your sympathetic nervous system or your fight or flight nervous system comes online, and that's why you get the racing heart and the sweaty palms and all that. If you can get the sympathetic nervous system or fight or flight response to calm down, you can often get the anxiety to calm down as well, right? Because when you get that response that you're looking for, the body is not secreting as much adrenaline and cortisol, and then you feel better because there's not as much of the fear and the stress hormones coursing through your body and your bloodstream. So I'm not saying that anxiety is easy to deal with or easy to shut down, but I will say that it can be easier because it is closely associated with those mechanisms. Depression is harder because we don't exactly know. We can't point to, a specific part of the brain or the nervous system and say, turn that thing off and you turn off depression. At the same time, you can deal with both, and there are things that you can do to combat both of them. So with that in mind, let's talk about two things. What I like to talk about right on the anxiety front is we've talked about evolutionary psychology and the fact that hundreds of thousands of years ago, right, if we were living on the savannah, we would see a predator, our bodies would kick into high gear, and we would run. And what would happen is, as soon as we evaded that predator, our bodies would go back into the calm state, into homeostasis. Obviously, that's not quite how things work these days, but that's like what the body is designed to do. We can also, with our thinking brains, we can continue to run the patterns if we want. And that is what can be so challenging about living in modern society with anxiety. With all of that said, I think what can be helpful is to say, all right, if if the idea of running away from a predator and then going back to homeostasis used to work or still works for, animals on the savannah, then maybe something like that could work for us as well. And so what I often say is, and a lot of folks will say this as well, is think about whatever is stressing you right now. You can't always run from it. You can't always fight with it as the fight or flight nervous system would want you to do. At the same time, however, you can, because your brain is still, evolutionarily speaking, it's still very old and it has all those mechanisms in it, you can still run or move your body or walk in general. And so what I tell folks is an actionable strategy is when you are feeling anxious, when you are revved up, even if the thing that is stressing you out is not immediately in front of you, get up, go for a walk, go for a run, move your body. And what you're doing is when you're taking that action, you're basically appeasing your nervous system, right? So if you think about sort of the neurotransmitters and the hormones that are coursing through your bloodstream when you're in front of that stressor, those are designed to get you moving, right? They're basically saying, this is a threat, take action, get out of here. Now, I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but I'm like, if you have a job interview, you can't really run from the job interview, but you can still run or move your body in general. And so what you want to do is you want to say, I'm feeling stressed out right now. I detect that. let me get up off my couch or out of my desk chair, go for a 5-minute walk, run around the block, that sort of thing. What you're doing is you're taking the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, the cortisol, the neurotransmitters, and saying, I'm putting you to the use that you want me to put you to. And at that point, you then send a calming message back to your nervous system and say, we did what you wanted us to do. Please turn off the alarms at this point. So that's like but it aligns with our physiology and the way that our brains are designed. So that's what I like to tell folks about anxiety when it comes to like one quick strategy. And I think the other thing that is helpful there as well, right, is like when you are really anxious and you're tied up in your thoughts, it can be really challenging to be like, well, I was at therapy and my therapist told me to walk through some like process and like think about all these different things. You don't really have time for that. Your brain is in high alert mode and all it can do is think like, I got to get out of here. There's no time for critical thinking. That's why you kind of need something that's like really quickly accessible, right? That's why mantras can be helpful, because when you're feeling anxious, you just go right back into that term or that phrase that you find helpful, right? So if your mantra is like, everything's going to be okay, that is, once you've said that to yourself 100,000 times, that's just embedded in your brain and you just pull it out and you recite it, right? You don't even have to think about it. In the same fashion, like us moving our bodies or even saying to ourselves, get up and move or just move, that is something that can be, plucked out pretty quickly and is still readily accessible even when our brains are going haywire. So let's put a pin in that one. So depression, I gave the preamble of saying that because there's no one system, especially like, the fight or flight nervous system, which is designed for acute things, depression tends not to be acute, right? We can't turn off that specific system and that system doesn't naturally turn off after some short period of time. So it's like, I say all this to basically tell the listener that as frustrating as it is, like we're probably not going to get out of depression in an hour, right? It can be a longer battle. It's something that we struggle with for some time. And part of the reason for that is often people will say that depression is a message from your psyche or your body or your brain to say that things are generally speaking not right. So if anxiety is like, hey, something is really not right in this moment, depression can be more of a, my whole life is not right, or big parts of my life are not right. And so that depression sometimes is trying to send a message to you to say, you need to make changes. And those changes, if they are really kind of at that broad level of your life, like you're not going to change your job and your family and your spouse and your dog overnight, right? Those things take time. And I'm not even saying that you need to, I'm just saying if it's a broad category, it's something that takes time. So keep in mind that when it comes to depression, it is harder to be like, hey, in 20 minutes, I'm going to feel less depressed or I'm not going to be depressed. With all of that in mind, one of the things that I talk a lot about in my second book is the notion of balance, right? So if you think about what I had just said in the sense of when things are generally not right in our lives, another way to say that is that something or multiple things have been tipped out of balance. So if you're like, hey, my job is so horrible right now for many reasons, then the scales in your mind have tipped out of balance, right? You might be really stressed. You might feel as though you have no time for yourself. You might feel as though you have no time for your family. You might feel as though that job is not only really stressful, but there's no meaning in it. And so therefore your whole life feels as though it has very little meaning in it. When it comes to depression, again, this is a wide and broad topic to enlist, but I will say to folks, like, sit down and think about the areas of your life that are most important, right? It could be 5, 6, 7, 10 different areas, and be honest with yourself. Say, how am I doing on a scale of 0 or 1 to 10 in each of those categories? And what it's designed to do, right? You want to strive for balance in all of those areas, right? You don't want 3 areas to be at a 0 or a 1 out of 10, and then a couple being at a 10 out of 10. You kind of want things to be in harmony, even if they're all at a 6 or a 7, that's still pretty good because you're like, I can't point at any one specific thing and say, I feel so horrible because this one category of my life is dragging everything down. So what I say in that second book, and there's an exercise that folks can go through if they grab that book, I would ask folks to sit down with themselves and do this process and say, okay, identify the pieces of your life that feel out of balance and address those things, right? Because when those things are out of balance, they're all we can focus on, right? It's like if, your family or your career or your finances or your physical health, if any one of those things goes to a 0 or a 1 or a 10, it's going to be very easy to like look at your chart or even just feel it in your body and be like, that's why I feel so horrible right now. And it's an invitation to be like, maybe you're not going to fix it overnight, but it's really being able to point to the problem and make it visible and say, now I know what I'm dealing with. And if I can get back to the point where some of those things that have fallen out of line, if I can bring them back up in line with those other categories, I think I'm going to feel better. And for a lot of folks, they do, right? You think about any one of these categories. If you're like, hey, me and my spouse have been fighting all the time. I'm really uncertain as to what our relationship is going to be like. And it just makes me feel so terrible. It's like, that's the work that you need to go do, right? At the same time, you're like, hey, if my job is very stressful and I don't know what I'm doing at work and I'm not feeling much meaning in it, that's a big part of your life that's going to eventually drag down all the other categories, right? You're going to feel that on a daily basis. So again, a really broad tactic. But again, depression is a broad condition. So I think it's important for us to look critically at our lives and say to ourselves, like, where can I bring in more balance? And the one thing that I will throw out there in terms of a quick win, there's some research that taking a cold shower can actually be very good for depression. It's essentially like you've got cold receptors on your skin, and when the cold water hits the skin, it sends an antidepressant-like effect up to the brain. Now, I take my cold showers, not all the time. It depends on the time of the year. I live in Boston. It can be very cold in the winter, so I'm not taking cold showers then. But in the summertime, I like to do it. And, even if it gives you a nice mood boost for 30 minutes to an hour, like depression is one of those conditions or diseases where it's like you're just looking for small win after small win that you can stack upon each other and hopefully get yourself to a better state over time. One large one small one. Again, like I'm not telling everybody to go run out and do a bunch of cold showers, but if you're feeling a little bit daring, that can be something that can help your mood.
Yes, I also heard, and I was actually wondering myself because I heard that when somebody's going through an acute attack, actually, I didn't know about depression, but anxiety, you actually like submerge your face or your head in cold water. It does something, I think it's to your vagus nerve. It calms it down. A therapist mentioned that, and I was wondering, like, but that might be, yes, the research behind it.
So that is the act of doing that activates what's called your dive reflex, and it essentially like calms your body down. There's something about being submerged in cold water that gives that response in the body. So people will often give that tactic for anxiety, but then also getting into a cold shower can be good for depression as well. So, I guess to kind of cap things off, right, is anxiety and depression, people will often say are like two peas in a pod. And if you think about, if you get on an SSRI, like if your doctor were to place you on one, he might place you or she might place you on that for either anxiety or depression or both.
That is right.
And so what that says to us is like the chemical pathways for these conditions are pretty similar. Therefore, a lot of the tactics and strategies that we enlist can be similar or have overlap as well.
Yes, we believe that anxiety and depression can definitely coexist. And I also heard people say, or I heard somewhere that anxiety is somehow being stuck in the future, and depression is being stuck in the past. They coexist.
Yeah, that quote fascinates me. There's actually so Aaron Beck, who's a very famous psychologist, he has this thing called Beck's cognitive triad or the negative triad. It is essentially saying that if you hold beliefs, specifically negative beliefs about three specific things, then you are likely to experience some flavor of depression. And the three categories are negative beliefs about yourself, negative beliefs about the world, and negative beliefs about the future. And so what I will sometimes say in response to that quote is, sure, depression can absolutely be a thing, that's sort of produced from the past, right? If a tragedy befalls you, then it's like you can absolutely get depressed over the fact that something happened in the past. At the same time, it's also very common if you feel depressed over the looming state of affairs of the world or where things might be heading or what your life might be 5-10 years from now, right? It's like people will often say that depression is essentially a disease of hopelessness. And so hopelessness is that projection out into the future of saying, why try? Why do anything? My life isn't going to get any better. The world isn't going to get any better. I'm just going to sit here and take it, or I'm going to give up, right? And so one of the remedies for depression is often regaining a sense of agency. And that can come through really small acts, right? If you say to yourself, like, I'm going to take up a hobby, like maybe it's woodworking, and you go into your shop every day or once a week or whatever, and you start to see the fact that like you're making cool pieces and you're learning and you're growing and you're producing more art and cooler art and you're getting really interested in this thing, all of a sudden, the fact that you're producing something shows you that you do have agency, which is, essentially the ability to go out and make change in the world. And so you start small and you say, hey, look, I made that one piece in my woodworking shop. And then from there, it's like, maybe, who knows, right? You kind of like start to get that hope momentum going, if you will. From there, you say, maybe I'm going to go like look for that job that I've been looking for, or maybe I'm going to go talk to that friend that I haven't talked to in a long time. Getting that agency back, that sense of agency and understanding that like, the future, I don't want to be too corny. Like I was about to say it's yours for the taking. That's a little corny, but like there's some truth to that in saying that like you can go out and you can make change in your own life. When you have that sense of sort of like when you're reinvigorated with that sense, all of a sudden it's like, hey, who knows what tomorrow's going to bring, rather than I'm looking out through the lens of, Aaron Beck's cognitive or negative triad and saying, everything's terrible, the world, the future, and me, it's all bad. Why try? So really coming back and saying, I have that sense of agency. I'm not just going to lay down here and take it or die. That is, again, I want to say that's the cure for depression, or at least that's the pathway, right? I don't know how everybody individually finds it, but sometimes those small wins that then stack up can be really helpful and really important.
Right. And when you think about I forget what you call those, it's funny, at the end of the day, the tables or the little tests that we give, like, well, for anxiety, it's the GAD, the GUTS, or the 9, and for depression. And I always notice that one of the first questions that you ask someone is, have you lost the desire for or pleasures? You lose that desire. It's like the motivation is gone. Doing what you just said, it actually targets going back into feeling alive again, feeling that you're making a difference, because that's part of life. The opposite is, to me, depression in a way. When I think about depression, I think about a dark black hole and like literally dying, because you're literally dying to yourself, to what makes us alive, being out there, whether it's good or bad. The opposite is definitely true. And then also something comes to mind, especially online communities in this day and age, or resources that you recommend, especially for those people who may not have that local support groups. Or do you know anything about that?
I know some, like I couldn't sit here and say, hey, go join this community, this Discord, that sort of thing. But I will say we're social creatures, right? And in this really modern world of ours, there's something, what do they call it? Either the connection paradox or the social media paradox. It's like, we're connected more than ever before, and yet we've never been more isolated from one another. Right? Connected in the sense that we have a lot of Facebook friends and a lot of Instagram friends and all that, but how many people do we really talk to intimately on a daily or a weekly basis, right? We need that sense of intimacy. We need that sense of social cohesion. I would tell folks, like, wherever you think you can get it from, as long as it's healthy, like, go for it. If you find like, and it's funny because a lot of people will find it in places that they didn't foresee, right? So they may say like, hey, I started playing this video game, and obviously there can be some real junk online when it comes to video game. But I know a lot of friends who are like, I met some really cool people and they're like my buddies now. We go online, we play together at a certain time, and they maybe they've never even met each other. Maybe they live across the world from one another, but getting that feeling of cohesiveness, community, social connection and all that, like, yeah, that is so important, and that is wired into us, into our brains, into our DNA. So however you can get it, yeah, definitely do that, because it's a tough world these days. We spend a lot of time online, and if you live in a city, right, it's very possible you live in a small apartment by yourself or with one roommate or something like that, and we don't connect with as many people as we used to. So we definitely need that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is what I'm loving about podcasting. I connect with so many people on the screen. And also, as we're talking here, we're connecting with our listeners and so on. So yeah, it's part of that community. That's what I call I'm building a community. Let's put it that way. So Totally love it. And then also, well, we already talked in both books, you do target some research on anxiety and depression. Now, let me ask you this really quick. Were there any findings that particularly surprised you, like, or change how you approach your own healing?
It's a tough question for me to answer because I think I'm at the point where like it's been such a long period of time that I don't see it the way that I used to. So like maybe 19-year-old me would be like, wow, I would be shocked by that. But at this point, it's kind of like the water that I swim in, so I've lost that shock factor.
Right.
If
What do
there
you
was
think will shock listeners to hear? Maybe what that shocked you like when you were younger? It is a
it's
hard
tough.
question.
It's the world that I live in now where I'm like, this just
Right.
is all second nature. I'm trying to think and just go back. I think for me, a difficulty that then led to something of a shock was the idea of being open and honest and vulnerable and the parallels that that has to mental health, right? I think for,
Right.
especially for men, right? Like, and everybody, but particularly men,
Man.
we definitely are like, we can't talk about those things. It wouldn't be manly to feel that way. I think it was a little shocking to like see the numbers and understand that, a good portion of the population deals with anxiety and depression, or maybe even both. And so getting to the point of normalizing it, right? And saying, if this many people experience this sort of thing, sure, it can still be challenging and frustrating and difficult and painful, but like, I'm not out here on an island, I'm not crazy. I can talk to people about this. I can be honest about it. And actually, not funniest thing, but what was fascinating to me was I think the stats are essentially like 1 in 5 in any given year will deal with a severe mental health condition. 1 in 5 will also, across their lifetime, deal with a depressive episode. And I think it's like 17%, high percentage of the population deals with anxiety on a regular basis or on a yearly basis as well. And when I saw those numbers, I'm like, okay, if we're looking in the 20% range, that means you get in a room with 4 other people or 5 other people, the odds are with you that somebody else that is in the room with you has also experienced these kind of things. So that helps you feel not as alone as well. It's a little terrifying to be like, hey, that many people deal with it, but there's two sides of every coin. And I think the other side is just the fact that, you can take solace in the fact that you can talk about this stuff and you can be not abnormal. You can be,
Yes.
received with open arms and people can want to talk to you about it.
That's what's important. That's what makes us to get closer, to know that there are things that actually unite us more than actually divide us in so many ways. And also wanted to ask you, I ask a lot of questions and I'm looking beyond volume 2, what's next? I mean, are
Yes.
there additional books, programs, anything coming up?
So I have been working actually like on an updated edition of my first book, just because it's been a while since it came out. And, like your writing style can change, your approach to life can change and all that. So I just want to make sure that, the fact that a lot of people find me through my first book, and I want to make sure that it's just as tight and professional as it can be. So I've been working on that for a long time. One of the challenges that I'm sure everybody who's listening can also relate to is, in this world of side hustles and all that, it's like, yeah, side hustles are great. And it's, writing it's more my passion project than a side hustle at this point, but it is in that realm of like, I get home from work and that's what I work on many nights and some weekends and all that. One of the challenges, right, is like you get to the point where you have a lot of commitments in life. You have a lot of things that you want to do, and it can be very difficult to find the time to work on some of these projects. So I am trying to get that project done. I've been working on it actually for a few years now. I'm trying to see like, how I can steal some time back from work or something. If I could
Right.
get a week of vacation here or there, or whatever it may be. That is what I have my eyes set on, is finishing that rewrite. And then from there, it's funny because like I haven't actually written a new book in 4-ish years. And part of me says like I have so many new stories to tell and a different information to get across. But like I also believe, as I'm sure you do, in the idea of as being an author, right? Like I don't think we just sit down and say like, let me come up with a book, right? Yeah. It's almost like a giving birth. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, got these ideas swirling through me. I go through a lot of difficult, work to get this thing out into the world, and eventually it's there. But if you're an author and you got into being an author as a result of going through difficult emotions or having life experiences, then I think that makes you want to put out things that are very authentic and have that purpose behind them. So for me, I'm kind of waiting and seeing what life brings me. I hope that nothing too terrible that I feel compelled to write about, but of different stories and working with different folks, we'll see. I do envision a volume 3 at some point in the future, but at the moment, unfortunately, the time is not quite there.
Let me ask you this because you probably, I don't know if you see, of course, you work with computers and I'm sure you know about the new technology waves that we're having out there with artificial intelligence. So when you were mentioning that, I'm thinking like, okay, what is it going to be like in the next 2 years, 5 years? And so I keep thinking maybe there's going to be a robot who's going to be doing all this busy work for me. And then I can sit down and write my books, find the time to do all these things that I want to do. But who knows, right? I mean, it's kind of like, there's all kinds of things that people are talking about jobs.
It's tough where like you and I, we don't want to lose our voice, right? Like an AI agent could probably write a book for us, but would it be us? And would it be our stories and all that?
I think that's where the difference is going to be because it's about the story itself.
Right.
I think that's where the difference, perhaps. They might be able to write it, but the story by itself, I mean, that's very interesting, right?
Yeah. And I feel like, for us, right, again, if we got into writing because of the meaning that it gives to us, it's like, what meaning is there in telling an AI bot to just spit out another story in our likeness, right? We want to tell the stories that are in our heads. We want to talk about how we work through those things. We want to talk about our own emotions. And we want that story to be pretty close to how it actually happened. Whereas, sure, maybe you could use an AI tool as your ghostwriter to be like, here's everything that I'm thinking of and all that. But I don't know. I think you definitely want your story to be real and authentic and in the world.
Yeah, the story will come from us for sure. I mean, I hope that we'll continue to create and to be ourselves. That's as authentic as we can be. So Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us your insights, all the wisdom, because I'm sure there's a lot into it. I can't wait to actually read your books. I'm piling up books from the authors that have been here. Believe me, I have one author who gave me a free version of the book. And so I'm like, okay, I'm listening to it. The other one I got from Kindle and so on. So I read a little bit here and there, and I still have to give some reviews because I love to share reviews. Like, okay, maybe I read your book, you read my book. We'll talk about it, right? But hey, thank you so much. Is there anything else that I did not ask you that you were like, oh, I wish I would have said that? Any last words?
I guess I would just say, like anxiety and depression are very difficult to deal with. And I'm sure a lot of folks who are listening are also dealing with those things or have dealt with them. Kind of just want to send a message of solidarity to the audience and say, I'm right there with you. It's very painful to go through these things, but as I hope this conversation illuminated, there are people that you can talk to about these things. Please reach out to me on social or through my website if you think it might be helpful. Really just trying to help as many people as I can and let people know that there's reason to keep going and, not to give up the fight.
Yes, I was going to ask you also, how can people get in touch with you? So through your website, right? Getoutofyourhead.com. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then all your socials are in there, okay? And yeah, I also wanted to reiterate the importance of community as well. For people out there, listeners, you're never alone. Just reach out. And that's one of the main reasons I created this podcast, to give a voice to the voiceless. If you feel like you want to, that's what we're here for, to share among each other. So thank you so much. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to Rosabel Unscripted podcast. Hit the notification button, subscribe, and we'll continue having these talks, okay? Goodbye, everybody. Thank you, Brian.
Rosabel.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode of Rosabel Unscripted podcast, here's how you can support our show. Visit www.rosabelzohfeld.com to learn more about my work, subscribe to my newsletter, and get updates on upcoming episodes. Head over to my YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button, and turn on notifications. Your subscription not only motivates me to keep creating, but also helps others discover these conversations. Share this episode with a friend or colleague. I want to invite you, yes, you listening right now, to check out my book, The Courage to Succeed: A True American Dream. It is available now on Amazon and also Barnes & Noble. This is a story of resilience, grit, and what it really means to chase your dreams, even when the odds are stacked against you. If you ever face fear, failure, or uncertainty, this book will meet you right there and remind you that courage always has a voice. Just search The Courage to Succeed: A True American Dream by Rosabel Zohfeld on Amazon, or head to the link in the show notes, because your dream is worth it and your courage can take you there.